Alrighty, I want to welcome everybody back for another video from Yates Computer Tips and Reviews. Now, this was a subject that I wanted to cover because this was really one subject that I did not know a lot of until I started getting into a lot of troubleshooting and a lot of issues and a lot of upgrading. And nowadays, this might be a major factor that comes into play for you. One of my videos that I mentioned was talking about some issues with this. The BIOS or the CMOS, it's basically the BIOS is what it's called. When you boot up your screen, there's a specific button. It's either, depending on the motherboard, manufacturer, and the chips, it's either escape, F1, it could be F10, F12, or delete. So usually once you figure that out, when it starts up, it'll tell you press F2 for menu or startup or something. It'll flash something like that. That's usually the button you need to push. Once you get in there, it has all your configurations of your system. This is important information to know how to configure and how to get around it. If you're a gamer, I'm sure you know how to go into this. When they talk about overclocking a system and how to do overclocking and to control your power, that's all through here. But one of the other key factors is in here you have all these other configurations. Hopefully everybody can see it. This is the best thing that I can see that seems like you can see it. But you can actually configure your boot up how you want it to boot. Some things boot off of a network connection where it boots off of a server. Those type of situations, those settings are set up here that you tell it to boot through your NIC instead of booting through your hard drive. In here there's PCI configurations, CPU configurations, let's see, NVMe configurations, there's security, thermals, your temperatures, what you want your fans to run at, and there's the big one that's a USB configuration. So on an older computer where you have USB on the front, USB on the back, in a business environment, maybe you don't want anybody to be plugging any USB in at all to that system. And you have, like this one I have over here has 4 USBs on the front. You can actually disable that front panel and leave the back panel on so that your mouse, keyboard, printer, whatever else you plug into the back is live. All of the front ones will shut off. So you don't have to worry about, does someone stick a USB drive in there? Does someone infect your computer? Does someone download data or any of those type of things? You'll know. If you're a home user and you have kids, grandkids, a bunch of people over that you don't really, I'll just say trust enough to do the right thing on your system, you may decide to disable those. Because then they can't put USBs in it. They can't load stuff in your computer. They can't play their games. They can't store a bunch of junk on your system. They can't clutter your system down. So that might be an effect for you to do this. So that's one of the factors you want to know. But remember, if you start troubleshooting and you need a USB port, you'll have to use the ones in the back. So you have to move the system around, put in your USB. If you do upgrades and you have other stuff on USBs or you store your photos on USB, it'll be on the back. So that's one of the things to be aware of. Some desks actually have little spots where it has a USB hub in it. Usually they're like up here in this range or down here or on the bottom. And there's a wire that runs out and you plug it into your computer. So that way you can actually have a USB spot somewhere accessible for you to do these things. And it'll plug into the back and you disable the front. That's another convenience. That's something you can do. So I wanted to touch on that because that's in this BIOS settings. BIOS settings is also your chipsets, your security. There's different securities you can do. If you do a security level in here and you set a password and you forget it, you cannot get into that computer. I want to touch on that. There's password locks in here that when you start up the computer, it'll ask you for a password before it even gets to your BIOS, before it even gets to your Windows boot ups, anything. It's a separate, unique password. Problem is, if you don't know that password and you forget it, you're out of luck. There's no way to reboot. There's no way to fix it. There's no nothing. You can't reflash it, clear it. You can't do anything. Because that's on your board. That's one of your primary chips. So that's one thing to be really careful of. But if you really need to be secure, again, you don't trust people in your household that are coming over to trust them with the data or not fool with your system, you might have to go to that extreme. My old laptop, I actually did have that set because I had so many different operating systems and so many other things in there, and I've learned in Linux there was a DOS command. If you got the DOS prompt, it would clear out all your Linux passwords. So I went with a stronger security password. I went for the BIOS password. So there is reasons why you'd want to use it. You really got to be careful on that, on those passwords. Boot order. You can see on here how it lists all kinds of stuff for boot order. Only thing I usually do is I go through and I remove or disable a lot of these for the boot sequence order and only leave what I need. So, like, there's floppy drive. There's quite a few different things on here that I could disable. Usually that will increase your boot up speed. Because if you tell your BIOS, look at my USB drive, because if you ever want to do an upgrade or anything like that, or you can go back in and change it at the time when you want to do those few feature upgrades or anything like that if you install a lot. But you don't need that. You can actually tell it, boot right to my M.2 drive, boot right to my SATA drive, skip everything else. I don't want you to look at my CD-ROM. I don't want you to look at my NIC card. I don't want you to look at any of these things, floppies, any of this stuff, SD drive, none of that. I want you to go right to the NVMe. So, like you can see here, it says you have your Windows drive boot up. You have your network. I don't really need it to look at my network, so I can actually go in and disable that, leave that, disable that. I would probably leave the USB hard drive in case you ever need to boot off of a USB hard drive for troubleshooting. You can disable CD-ROM, since this thing doesn't even have a CD-ROM. Floppy it doesn't even have. So you can disable some of those features so it'll boot up a little quicker. Some BIOSes are pretty slow, especially if you get into servers. They can be pretty slow. And if you have certain things like this enabled, where it's looking out at the NIC card and you have 2 or 3 NICs on it that it wants to check, and then it's looking at your CD-ROM, and then it's looking at this and it's looking at that, that can compound the problem, because as for a server, it goes through a lot more processes. So even if you're at home, you might be running a home server, you might be doing something of that sort. These will help benefit the speed up. Because if you ever have a power outage or some other sort, or you're troubleshooting and you want to work on it, doing Windows updates where you have to reboot the system, this stuff will speed it up. Will help it get to the actual Windows drive to load up faster than it trying to do all its configurations and check everything over and over and over again that you're not even using. So that's part of the main thing that I wanted to show. Because where this comes into play is, I've mentioned if you wanted to speed up your computer, a lot of people have mentioned the same thing. If you want to speed up your computer, change to a solid state drive. Go to an M.2 drive. Problem is you have this factor. A lot of people don't know how to change the setup. In one of the videos I did, I had talked about where I had a certain machine. I don't remember the exact model. I have a video of it. It's really a popular one where no matter what I changed in this BIOS, it would not boot from one drive to the other. Whatever the BIOS recognized in there is what it would recognize and boot to. So when I was trying to mirror over all my data from the old drive to the new drive, I had an old mechanical spinning drive to a solid state drive. It was having a lot of issues with that for some weird reason. Don't know why. It's the same thing I've done on all the different other makes and models and everything else. You go in there, you tell it, okay, I want you to go to the SATA drive, I want you to go to this SATA drive, and I want you to boot to that SATA drive. It was having a hard time recognizing the other one when the other one was there setting to boot. So what I had to do is put the one in, let the Windows and everything else recognize on that computer that that was the one that it's booting to, shut down, put in the new drive as a secondary on a different connector, go in, boot up, make sure the BIOS sees it, make sure Windows sees it, make sure Windows enables it, and then I mirrored over or copied over all the data from the one drive to the other drive. That's usually pretty simple to do. And then what you would do is it shuts off, you go and you take out the other drive, and then you boot on the other drive. Problem is it would fail the first time. Say it cannot find drive, blah, 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 blah. It would restart, and then it would have to make sure that it would see the other drive being on their C drive and then boot to that drive. It was really a weird little situation where something in that BIOS chip or in that software and that addition of software, it was not working properly. But it wasn't a big deal because it just took a little longer, and you had to just take one out, put the other one in, get it to recognize, get it to boot, get everything up, get everything working, and it was, you know, switch back and forth. It was kind of a nuisance. You had to unplug, plug things in, back and forth to get it all to work. But I got it to work. So it was really an interesting thing, and that was due to the BIOS. Now there's BIOS versions. I don't know if I can find that on this laptop. And then you go into save, discard settings, go back to factory default. In case you change something, you mess something up, go back to the factory default, because maybe you changed something and now it's not booting because you changed the boot sequence, you sent it to the wrong drive, set it to the wrong settings, legacy, you know, whatever, RAID, whatever settings that are in there, that you may have just misconfigured something. But yeah, in here, it should give you your BIOS version. Usually there's also a date you can find. You can also find that in your system file on your computer. It'll tell you all about your drive and all of that. Usually it tells you the BIOS date and all of that. I like to have them updated. A lot of people will tell you it's not important to update them. But they found that they had some issues with malicious software that was due to your BIOS. They rewrote BIOSes, they added more security, they added more features into the BIOS so that it works better for the computer. So it works out sometimes to really update that BIOS. If your computer's being a little funny, check your version. Problem with updating BIOSes is if they get a bad BIOS, you put the wrong BIOS in, you can corrupt and crash your computer and lock it, brick it. Sometimes you can recover. Some of the newer boards have dual BIOSes where you can change because it's really a common problem. So for home users, they really don't recommend you updating them. If you do update them, I recommend highly that you're on a battery backup. Because if you're doing it and the power goes out, you can corrupt it, crash, and lock up your system. You always want to be on a battery backup. Always. because it might surge, you could have anything happen, and that's the absolute wrong time for that to happen. So I wanted to go through this because this is really something nobody talks about. Even I didn't really talk about it too much when I recommended that to people. If you want to speed up your system, change the drive. Because a lot of times you really don't have to get in here. A lot of times you load your software, you mirror it over and you change it. The BIOS is smart enough when it runs, it will fix itself and will correct what's there. But sometimes when you hook both drives up to copy the data over, you can have issues. So that's why this becomes important. If you add video cards, any of those type of things, usually when you add a video card, it makes that video card primary and disables the one on the motherboard. So let's say you want to have two monitors, you put in a new video card and you expect to use the one on the motherboard. All of a sudden, one on the motherboard stops working. You can't figure out why. It's just black. You go, I don't understand. I got two of them in there. It changed settings in here. So you have to go in there and enable it and make sure that you're running both video cards. The BIOS will do that. That is part of why I mentioned power supplies, about video cards, your add-ons. Because this will tell you you should only be running one. There's a reason why it only wants one. Number one is your voltage and other things. How the buses are set up on the board and how they communicate to the CPU and all of that are different. It handles the packages different. You can run both. But this will be one of the factors that will come up and get you. I don't think there's too many other things that really come up other than the video card. When you add a video card, it disables the other one. I think you can add extra NICs. I've done it. Used the one on the board. I don't believe it disables it. It's pretty much the video card. Probably because the video card takes so much voltage. So that's why it does it. But this is where you go into and you fix it. So I wanted to do a short video on this because this is really something that's not explained. And really it's not something I would say to go in there and mess with. It's something to go look at. It's something if you know what you're doing and you know what you need to do, you can. It's kind of like a registry. You don't really mess with the registry on the computer. But with this, most of it is reversible because it's only an on and off. Registries, you can actually delete all the data. And then you have nothing. You can't turn it back on. Some registry items you can turn on and off. So that's kind of handy. But you get into a lot of touchy things with the registries. This is broken down pretty simple. One of the other things I do on computers is you have SATA ports. Let's say you have 4 SATA ports. You have a floppy drive or a CD-ROM, not floppy, I'm stuck on that today, and you have your hard drive on there. So you have 2 out of 4. A lot of times I go in and I turn off the other SATA drives. I disable them. That helps your computer boot up faster. That helps your computer realize there's really nothing there. Your computer will scan those drives every time you start and say, oh, there's nothing there, we can skip this. But why have it waste all that time? Why have it do those processes? Not to mention, nobody can plug anything into it. Nobody can open up your hard drive or computer and throw something in there and walk away. If they did, it's not going to work. You have to go into the BIOS to make it work. So you have that little bit of security to know that even in a business, that's a good thing, because you might have an employee that wants to work on a family member's hard drive when they're working. You know, oh, let's plug that in, and you know, they have extra ports, so they think they should be plugging that in. I mean, they could technically unplug what's in there and plug that in, but you have that little bit more security that that's not going to happen. Oh, I think that's it. There's not too much I can go through in the BIOS. I wanted someone to see what it is. I want you to actually see it. All BIOSes will be different. Every motherboard manufacturer, every BIOS chip is different. So they will be different. It's not going to be the exact same layout. Older ones don't have exactly everything there. Some of them you have to use key commands. It'll tell you down there. It tells you here what the key commands actually do. And some of them will let you use a mouse. Some of them won't. You have to scroll left. You have to scroll right. You know, those type of things. So wanted to go through this so everybody understands this. Because if you don't, and you come across this issue where you may need to look at this, there's now a video there for you to look at. So you can understand what's going on. Why is this important? Why are you having the issue? Because a lot of times, if you look at troubleshootings or you look at other things, they'll tell you, check your BIOS. And that's all they'll tell you. And unless you actually understand what in the world they're talking about by the BIOS, is that in your Windows? Where is that? How do you find it? It's kind of difficult to find because most people, when you turn on your computer, you're not paying attention to what it's even doing until the Windows logo comes up. You hear the bing, 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 and it comes up, and then you log in, or it automatically logs you in. So if you have one of those systems that already logs you in and comes up, you probably have no clue about any of these processes that's been taking place. You don't even see it. You don't even recognize it. It's just part of the boot up. You wait for it's done and you go and do your thing. And then you shut down. So that's one of the factors. This is kind of hidden. I ran into a problem when I started into computers. I knew a lot about hardware and I knew a lot about other things. And they told me, oh, you just go into the BIOS and do this. And I'm like, what are you talking about? I did not understand how much this controlled inside the Windows environment. I understood this just started the computer, gave it the basic instructions, and it did what it did. Not realizing that certain things can be literally turned off in here that will affect the Windows. So that's one of the things that I'm pressing on this, because it might not be Windows itself. It might actually be your BIOS. Video card is the prime example. You put that other card in, your one on your motherboard just stops working. It's because in the BIOS is set up so when you recognizes a new video card, that it'll just turn off the other one and run on the other one. And what's weird is you'll put the new card in and you'll boot up and you'll be on that monitor configuring the new card, and then when it restarts, it's just black. So it kind of throws you off because you were using it, but now you can't. Because when you restarted and the BIOS restarted, the BIOS did the changes. So let me wrap this one up. Make sure you guys hit the likes, subscribes, all of that good stuff. Leave your comments. Forward this out to people. Let people know. Because this is all helpful information. This is stuff that will save you tech calls, troubleshooting calls. You don't want to be on the phone for hours and hours with some tech call over something like this. Because once they start explaining it to you, you're not going to understand it at all. Because until you get it in front of you and see what they're even talking about. And then, if your BIOS is slightly different than what they're looking at on the screen, you're going to be completely lost. Oh, just move over a tab and go to your chipset. Well, your chipset is actually 2 on this. It could actually be a completely different layout from what he's looking at, that you don't understand what chipset is. What is this? What is that? Some of them are actually abbreviated where you can only see M, A, C, S, B, you know, and it'll have exit. It'll be just the first letter. So you won't know what chipset is. So this is really why I'm pressing this. And I hope everybody understands. Because if you ever need to get into that, if you ever need to do troubleshooting, this can be a headache. most of the time you don't need to get in there. I'm used to getting in there when I work on the computers and I do what I need to do and I make sure things are changed and I make sure certain things are disabled and certain things are set up the way I want. But most of the configurations are done for boot up and all of that. But then I go in and I make sure that extra SATAs are off, all the extra NIC cards are boots off, all the other stuff that slows down the boot process is turned off. That's basically all I do in there. Once it's booting up, I go in, customize it, that's it, and I'm done. So I'll wrap this up. Now that you've seen it on the laptop, this is my new laptop that I got. So you'll be seeing this in probably more videos because this actually shows up on the screen better than the monitor I have. So, alrighty, thank you.